Dungeon right.
If you watched my last video on Frank Metzner's Basic Dungeons and Dragons, the famous red box, then you know just how important that game was. The red box was designed to take somebody who had never played Dungeons and Dragons before and teach them how to play. But eventually, your characters reached third level, and then came the question, what happens next? Well, that's where this comes in. The Dungeons and Dragons Expert Rules, also known as the Blue Box, or in my particular case, the Blue Box without the box. Because this is another one of those pieces of Dungeons and Dragons history that I had to go back and find later in life. I bought my copy off eBay. It didn't come with the original box, but fortunately it did come with the expert rule book and this X1, the Isle of Dread. And there's actually something appropriate about owning it this way, because unlike the basic rules, the expert rules aren't just something that I can really sit here and tell you that I completely experienced it when I was younger. Yes, I played them and I have memories of them, but I didn't really know them. And there's a difference. You see, when I was younger, my cousin Shelly had the books. Well, she got them from a boyfriend who broke up with her and left them at her house. And Shelly became the dungeon master. So my experience with Expert D&D was from the other side of the screen. I was a player, and I remember having fun with it. I remember the characters, I remember the adventures, and I remember that wonderful feeling we used to have when Dungeons and Dragons wasn't something that we analyzed. We just played it.
Hail, Lord Vecna. Hail, Lord Vecna.
Nobody was sitting around debating game design. Nobody cared whether something was old school. Back then, it wasn't old school. It was just Dungeons and Dragons. You rolled up a character, somebody drew a map, the dungeon master described what you saw, and off you went. Because Shelley was the DM, I didn't spend my time studying this book. I didn't sit down and examine the wilderness rules, the weapons and equipment list. I wasn't thinking about campaign construction. I wasn't studying encounter tables or looking at how the game changed once characters moved beyond those first few levels. I was experiencing the results of those rules without really understanding what was happening underneath them. And looking back on it now, that's actually kind of interesting, because I experienced Expert D&D exactly the way a player should. I saw the world. Where Shelley saw the machinery that made that world work, again, I saw the world. And it wouldn't be until years later when I bought the Dungeons and Dragons Rules Cyclopedia that I finally started understanding how much game existed beyond basic D&D. The Rules Cyclopedia brought together the rules from the basic, expert, companion, and master sets into one enormous volume. And I mean, this thing's hefty. It's a reprint copy, of course, but still, try to get one off of eBay now, an original one. You might as well cut off your left arm and your right leg and give it, because that's what they're going for these days. With this, I can actually sit down and start to read all of the material myself. And that's when things start to click. Things that I vaguely remembered from playing with Shelley suddenly had context. Suddenly it was, oh, that's how that worked. And that's where that rule came from. And no wonder why we were doing it that way. And I began realizing that Basic Dungeons and Dragons wasn't really a complete description of this version of D&D. You know, Basic was just the beginning, and Expert was where the world started getting bigger. Much bigger. To understand where Frank Metzner's Expert set, we need to back up things just a little bit. Expert D&D actually existed before Metzner's version. In 1981, TSR had published the Expert set, edited by David Zeb Cook, as the companion to Tom Mulvey's Basic set. Then in 1983, TSR revised Basic Dungeons and Dragons again, and the man responsible for that revision was Frank Metzner. Metzner wasn't simply trying to rewrite D&D for the sake of changing it. There was a much bigger idea behind what he was doing. The goal was to take somebody who knew absolutely nothing about role-playing games, teach that person how to play, teach them also how to be a dungeon master, and then gradually expand the game as their characters became more powerful. Instead of dropping one enormous rule book in front of a new player, D&D could grow alongside them. And that eventually became the 5-box progression that we now call BECMI, made up of the Basic, Expert, Companion, Master, and finally Immortal rule sets. Basic handled characters from levels 1 through 3. Expert expanded the game through level 14. Companion continued through level 25. Master took characters all the way through level 36. And Immortal went beyond ordinary mortal adventuring entirely. That progression is one of my favorite things about Metzner's version of D&D, because the game actually changes as your character grows. Think about what Metzner's Red Box taught us. Basic D&D is intimate. Your world is small. There's a dungeon. There's a town somewhere nearby. You've got a sword. You've got 10 hit points if you were lucky. And somewhere down that hallway is probably something capable of killing you. That's basic D&D. You're trying to survive. But Expert says, all right, you survived. Now come on outside. And suddenly the scale changes. The dungeon isn't the world anymore. The dungeon is just one location in the world. Now we're talking about wilderness exploration, overland movement, getting lost, travel, ships, new monsters, new encounters, more powerful spells, more equipment, longer campaigns, and eventually characters reach the point where they can establish strongholds and begin leaving a permanent mark on the campaign world. That's a tremendous shift in perspective. Basic taught you how to go on an adventure. Expert begins teaching you how to have a campaign. The Expert rulebook is about 64 pages long. And that's an incredible amount of information to pack into a very small number of pages. Characters, they now advance beyond third level, with the humans classes eventually reach in level 14 under the rules. And clerics and magic users gain access to more powerful spells. There's also an expanded, let's see here if I can quickly find it. No, that's procedures. And that's where that rule came from. And no wonder why we were doing it that way. And I began realizing that basic Dungeons and Dragons wasn't really a complete description of this version of D&D. You know, basic was just the beginning, and expert was where the world started getting bigger. Much bigger. Now, as I said, the known world. I love that name because the known world implies that there's an unknown world somewhere beyond the edge of that map. And for a game built around exploration, that's perfect. The expert rules gave dungeon masters enough information to begin placing their adventures into a larger geographical context. There are nations, there's wilderness areas, roads, oceans. These were places that your characters could actually travel to. And suddenly the question simply wasn't, which door do you want to open? But instead it became, where do you want to go? And those are two very different kinds of Dungeons and Dragons. Which brings us to the Isle of Dread, the adventure that came with the expert set. This was written by David Zeb Cook and Tom Mulvey. The Island of Dread originally accompanied the earlier expert set and was retained by Mentzner's expert rules. And TSR couldn't have chosen a much better adventure to demonstrate what expert D&D was trying to accomplish. I mean, it simply wasn't just another dungeon. You've got an island, you've got wilderness, you've got villages, you've got ruins, you've got monsters, you've got places up to explore, and yes, even dinosaurs. And to a young kid like me back then who was not only into Dungeons and Dragons, but dinosaurs, that was a pretty cool thing. And also you've got huge portions of the map where the players simply have to decide, where do we go? That's the magic of the Isle of Dread. It gives you a destination, but it doesn't give you a railroad. I mean, you explore, you make decisions, you get lost, and you discover things. Sometimes you discover things that you probably wish that you hadn't discovered. And hopefully, by the graces of the dice gods, you survived. And it is Dungeons and Dragons as exploration. And, I mean, for the expert set designed to show players that the world can, not only can, but does extend far beyond the dungeon, the Isle of Dread is almost the perfect adventure. And of course, we have to talk about the artwork, because this is the Mentzner era, and that means Larry Elmore. That blue expert box is one of those classic pieces of Dungeons and Dragons imagery. You have a warrior on horseback. You have a dragon, mountains in the distance, a huge wilderness stretching out around them. And whether that symbolism was intended or not, it fits these rules beautifully. I mean, look at the red box. The confrontation with the dragon fills the scene. It feels intimate. It feels immediate. It feels close, dangerous. And then you look at expert. There's space. There's distance. There's a horizon. There's a whole world surrounding that encounter. And to me, the two boxes almost tell the story of the rules themselves. Basic says, here's the adventure. Expert says, here's the world. Now, looking back at these rules, especially after having spent so many years with the Rules Cyclopedia, I appreciate Mentzer's approach more today than I ever could have as a kid. He didn't try to teach you everything at once. He let Dungeons and Dragons unfold. First, you learn what a character is. Then you learn what a dungeon master does. You explore a dungeon, you gain some levels, and you become comfortable with the rules. And right about the time you think you've got D&D figured out, the blue box arrives and essentially says, you haven't seen anything yet. The dungeon walls disappear, and now you have an entire wilderness. And later, you're going to rule domains, command armies, build castles, become legendary heroes, and eventually, if you keep going far enough, you might even become an immortal. But it happens gradually, and I think that's one of the great strengths of BECMI. The complexity grows alongside the player. So what do I think about the expert rules today? I think this might actually be where classic D&D really starts breathing. I love basic D&D. There's something almost perfect about those early levels. You have a handful of adventurers, a lantern, a 10-foot pole, a few gold pieces, and a dark hole in the ground. That's D&D distilled down to its absolute essentials. But Expert gives those adventurers somewhere to go. The characters who survive the dungeon can walk out of the entrance, look towards the horizon, and keep going. You know, that's something wonderful about that. I don't know. Now, my copies aren't pristine. I don't have the boxes. I didn't open this thing on Christmas morning in 1983. I bought it years later off eBay. I've got the expert rule book. I've got the Isle of Dread. And that's enough for me. Because when I hold these today, I'm getting the opportunity to experience something that I only partially experienced when I was younger. Back then, these were Shelley's books, and she was the dungeon master. I was a scared little kid sitting on the other side of the screen, waiting to find out what happened to my character next. And you know what? I'm glad that's how I experienced, because those memories are part of what made me love this game to begin with. And now I can come back, open the rule books, read the rules that were behind those adventures, and finally understand what Frank Metzer and TSR were building. The Rules Encyclopedia eventually gave me the whole game in one box. I mean, one book. But there's something special about seeing the game the way the players originally encountered it in the beginning. One box at a time, one adventure at a time. Basic taught us how to enter the dungeon. Expert taught us how to leave it. And somewhere beyond that dungeon entrance was an entire world waiting to be explored. So that's my look back on Menser's Dungeon & Dragon Expert Rules, the blue box. Even if I don't actually have the blue box, maybe someday I'll find one. But until then, these will do just fine. We're not finished with BECMI yet, because we're going to learn we've learned how to survive the dungeon, we've crossed the wilderness, we've reached higher levels, and the next step now is where Dungeons & Dragons starts changing again. Because eventually an adventurer stops simply exploring the world and starts becoming powerful enough to change it. And that's where the companion rules come in. And we'll be talking about those soon enough. Until next time, take care of one another. Keep those dice rolling. Keep your lantern burning. And never stop exploring the worlds that exist just beyond the edge of the map.
Dungeon ride that doesn't wizard cast a spell on you. That old school dungeon master dude. He rolls the dice and lets the fates decide who lives or dies tonight. That dungeon master extraordinaire. The dungeon rite.